The 1st of July 2018, 11:18 inches the morning. Inside one of France's most secure prisons, a prison guard hears an unfamiliar sound. At first, it resembles a leaf blower. Then it grows louder. Within seconds, every alarm inside the facility begins to sound. A helicopter is descending directly toward the prison. This shouldn't be possible. The prison was specifically designed to prevent aerial escapes. 17-foot concrete walls, armed watchtowers, reinforced steel doors, anti-helicopter cables stretched across the courtyards. Every weakness had supposedly been eliminated. Yet somehow, someone had found one that nobody else had seen. The helicopter doesn't land. It hovers. 3 masked men jump out carrying assault rifles, smoke grenades, and an industrial angle grinder. They aren't here to attack the prison. They're here for one man. Deep inside the visitor's wing, the most heavily guarded inmate in France sits calmly talking to his brother. He doesn't panic. He doesn't look surprised, almost as if he already knows what's about to happen. 10 minutes later, he'll be gone. No tunnels, no hidden keys, no corrupt guards. Just a helicopter, a handful of armed men, and one of the most audacious escape plans in modern history. But perhaps the most unbelievable part isn't that the escape succeeded. It's that this wasn't the first time Redouane Faïd had escaped from prison. So how does one man repeatedly outsmart an entire justice system? And how did a prison built to stop helicopters become the stage for one of the greatest prison escapes ever recorded? Long before the helicopter appeared over the prison walls, French authorities believed they had solved a very specific problem: Redouane Faïd. By 2018, he wasn't just another inmate. He was considered the country's most dangerous escape artist. Years earlier, he had already broken out of another high-security prison using a smuggled handgun and explosives. That escape embarrassed the French justice system. Officials promised it would never happen again. This time, they built a prison designed specifically to hold men like him. Every layer of security had a purpose. Massive concrete walls surrounded the complex. Watchtowers overlooked every corner. Armed officers stood ready with assault rifles. Movement inside the prison was tightly controlled. Even the visitors area for high-risk inmates was deliberately placed deep inside the facility, as far from the main entrance as possible. If someone ever attempted a rescue, guards believed they would have plenty of time to respond. Faïd himself was placed under extraordinary restrictions. He spent much of his time in solitary confinement. Whenever he left his cell, multiple officers escorted him. Every visit was monitored. Every phone call was recorded. Every movement was documented. To prison officials, he wasn't simply serving a sentence. He was a constant security threat. And yet, something about him never seemed to change. The guards often described him as calm, polite, even charming. He joked with officers, smiled during inspections, never appeared frustrated. It almost looked as if prison didn't bother him at all. Looking back, investigators would later wonder if that calmness had been part of the plan all along, because while the guards believed they were studying Faïd may have been studying them, learning routines, observing response times, memorizing blind spots, waiting patiently. Then, a few days before the escape, something unusual happened. A drone was spotted flying above the prison. It disappeared before anyone could identify its operator. At the time, officials treated it as a minor security incident. Only later would they realize it had probably been the final rehearsal. Because somewhere outside those walls, someone had already found the prison's only weakness. About 20 kilometers from the prison, another part of the plan was already unfolding. 65-year-old helicopter instructor Stéphane B. believed he was about to enjoy a routine flight. Earlier that morning, 2 new customers had contacted him, a father and his son. They weren't interested in learning to fly. They simply wanted to experience a short helicopter ride, and specifically requested one of his vintage aircraft, a light helicopter from the 1950s. The request seemed unusual, but not suspicious. They paid in cash, 500 euros. Everything appeared normal. Shortly after takeoff, the passengers asked if they could make a brief stop in an open field. They claimed they needed a bathroom break. Stéphane landed without hesitation. The 2 men disappeared behind a line of trees. A minute later, they returned. But they were no longer tourists. They were carrying assault rifles. One of them pointed the weapon directly at the pilot. Then came the words that changed everything. "We know where your family lives." The men claimed they had been watching him for months. According to them, accomplices were already waiting outside his home. If he refused to cooperate, his wife and family would die. Whether every part of that threat was true didn't matter. The pilot believed it, and that was enough. From that moment on, he was no longer flying passengers. He was flying armed kidnappers. The helicopter landed once more, in another isolated clearing. Several more men emerged from nearby vehicles carrying large black duffel bags. Inside were assault rifles, smoke grenades, gas masks, an industrial angle grinder. Everything needed for a military-style assault. Only then did Stefan realize this had never been about stealing a helicopter. The helicopter was simply the last piece of a plan that had been prepared long before he ever received the booking. As the engine roared back to life, one of the gunmen leaned toward the pilot and quietly gave him a destination. Not an airport, not another field, a maximum security prison. And at that exact moment, without anyone inside the prison realizing it, the escape had already begun. Would you risk your own life to protect your family? Or would you refuse, knowing what these men were about to do? To understand why hundreds of police officers feared one man so much, you have to understand who Redouane Faïd really was. Long before he became France's most wanted fugitive, he was just a boy growing up in a crowded housing project outside Paris. His parents were Algerian immigrants. His father worked long hours in a factory. His mother cleaned houses. Money was always scarce. The family shared a tiny apartment with 10 other siblings. From an early age, Faïd felt like an outsider. He would later describe, "Growing up between two different worlds, too poor to belong, too invisible to be noticed." His first theft came when he was only 6 years old. It wasn't planned. It wasn't sophisticated. Just a small item stolen from a department store with his older brother. When his parents found out, his father whipped him with a belt and his mother made him promise he would never steal again. For a while, he meant it, but something else had already captured his imagination. Movies. Crime movies. Every chance he got, Faïd disappeared into movie theaters. He watched French gangster films over and over. Then, he discovered Hollywood, Scarface, Point Break, Reservoir Dogs, and perhaps the film that influenced him more than any other, Heat. Most people watch these films as entertainment. Faïd watched them like training manuals. He memorized the dialogue. He studied how the characters moved, how they escaped, how they planned, how they stayed calm under pressure. As a teenager, he wasn't just copying the clothes. He was copying the mindset. By the time he turned 18, fiction had begun turning into reality. He committed his first armed bank robbery. Witnesses later recalled that he spoke almost like an actor reading from a script. The words weren't really his. Some of them had been lifted almost directly from the movies he loved. Over the next 2 decades, investigators noticed a strange pattern. One robbery resembled Point Break. Another looked remarkably similar to Reservoir Dogs. Then came an armored truck heist that reminded detectives of scenes from Heat. It was as if Redouane Faïd wasn't inventing crimes. He was directing them. Years later, he openly admitted that cinema had shaped the way he thought about robbery. But there was one crucial difference. Movies end after 2 hours. Real life doesn't. And eventually, every action film reaches the moment where the hero runs out of luck. The question was, did Redouane Faïd truly believe he was smarter than the police? Or had he simply spent so many years playing the role that he could no longer tell the difference between the movies and reality? By the late 1990s, Redouane Faïd was no longer robbing small banks. He wanted something bigger, something worthy of the films he admired. His new obsession was armored cash trucks. To Faïd, they were the ultimate challenge. Millions of euros, armed guards, split-second timing. It was the closest thing to recreating Heat in real life. One afternoon on the outskirts of Paris, his crew made their move. A stolen car slammed into the armored truck. Within seconds, 2 more vehicles blocked the front and rear. Masked gunmen carrying AK-47s surrounded the truck with military precision. Everything unfolded exactly as Faïd had imagined. The guards surrendered almost immediately. Explosive charges were placed against the vehicle. Bags of cash were pulled out one after another. But then the plan began to fall apart. There was simply too much money. Loading millions of euros took far longer than anyone had expected. Every extra second increased the risk. And eventually, the sound Fayed feared most echoed through the streets. Police sirens. Gunfire erupted. Bullets tore through the air as officers arrived at the scene. During the exchange, Fayed was shot in the shoulder. His crew managed to escape, but they left behind something far more valuable than cash: blood. Investigators quickly collected DNA from the crime scene. For the first time, they had a direct link connecting Redouane Fayed to one of France's most sophisticated robbery crews. The man who had spent years treating crime like cinema had finally left behind real evidence. From that moment on, the police weren't simply investigating another robbery. They were hunting the director behind it. And for Redouane Fayed, the next chapter would no longer be about pulling off the perfect heist. It would become something even more dangerous: learning how to escape when the entire country was trying to capture him. The police eventually caught Redouane Fayed, but keeping him in custody proved to be an entirely different challenge. In 1998, after months on the run, Fayed was arrested in Switzerland while trying to return to France. For most fugitives, that would have been the end of the story. For Fayed, it was only the beginning. While being escorted by German officers, he saw an opportunity. In a split second, he broke free and sprinted across active railway tracks. A passing train cut off the pursuing officers, buying him precious seconds. Injured but still moving, Fayed limped into a nearby hotel and hid inside an empty room while police searched the city outside. For hours, he remained completely silent. When he finally attempted to escape, he calmly approached the hotel receptionist and asked for change to use a public telephone. The receptionist never noticed that his hands were still locked in handcuffs. He walked away unnoticed. Eventually, police surrounded the hotel and captured him. Most people would assume the escape attempt was over. They were wrong. The very next day, officers escorted Fayed to a hospital to treat the ankle he had injured while fleeing. He appeared weak, barely able to walk, leaning heavily on his crutches. Everything about his body language suggested pain. It was all an act. Without warning, Fayed dropped the crutches, lunged toward one of the officers, and disarmed him in seconds. Investigators later learned he had trained in Krav Maga, a military self-defense system designed to neutralize armed opponents as quickly as possible. Before the second officer could react, Fayed struck him, seized another weapon, and ran. For the second time in less than 24 hours, he had escaped police custody. By then, investigators began noticing a disturbing pattern. Fayed didn't rely on luck. He relied on preparation. He studied people. He memorized routines. He waited patiently for tiny mistakes. Then he moved with incredible speed. Every successful escape reinforced the same conclusion. This wasn't simply a talented robber. It was a man obsessed with planning every possible outcome, which explains why, years later, when prison officials spotted a drone flying above one of France's most secure prisons, they dismissed it as a harmless curiosity. They had no idea they were watching the final rehearsal for an operation that had probably been planned for months, or perhaps even years. So here's the question: was Redouane Fayed the smartest escape artist of his generation? Or did he simply expose weaknesses that had been hiding inside the system all along? By the morning of the 1st of July 2018, every piece of the plan was finally in place. The helicopter hovered above the prison courtyard, its spinning blades drowning out the sound of the alarms below. Thick white smoke poured across the concrete. Visibility dropped to almost zero. Inside the chaos, two masked men jumped from the aircraft carrying an industrial angle grinder and assault rifles. They weren't looking for a fight. They knew exactly where they were going. The grinder screamed to life. Steel doors that were supposed to delay intruders for several minutes were cut open in less than a minute. One security barrier after another disappeared. Inside the prison, confusion spread faster than the smoke. Some guards searched for cover. Others called emergency dispatch. One officer contacted local police, only to have the operator assume it was a prank. The armed sentries inside the watchtowers finally spotted the helicopter. But by then, it was too late. French protocol prohibited them from firing at an aircraft still in flight. The very rule designed to protect innocent lives had become the weakness the escape team was counting on. Then, the final door opened. Redouane Fayed stepped into the corridor exactly as planned. He didn't hesitate. He didn't run blindly. He moved with the confidence of someone who had rehearsed this moment in his mind hundreds of times. As he crossed the courtyard, two inmates stared in disbelief. Fayed paused for just a second, raised his hand, and gave them a casual military-style salute. Moments later, he climbed into the helicopter. Exactly 10 minutes after it had entered the prison, the aircraft lifted back into the air and disappeared beyond the walls. One of the most secure prisons in Europe had just been defeated. Not by explosives, not by overwhelming force, but by planning, timing, and a team that understood the system better than the people protecting it. The escape dominated headlines around the world. To some, Redouane Fayed looked like a criminal genius. To others, he was proof that no prison is truly escape-proof. The manhunt lasted almost 3 months before police finally tracked him to an apartment outside Paris. Disguised beneath a burqa, he had once again tried to vanish into ordinary life. This time, there would be no dramatic escape. In 2020, Fayed was convicted for both the helicopter escape and his role in earlier crimes, receiving decades of additional prison time. Today, he remains under some of the strictest prison conditions in France. Multiple guards escort him whenever he leaves his cell. He is searched repeatedly. His movements are heavily restricted. Authorities are determined that there will never be a third escape. But perhaps the most fascinating part of this story isn't the helicopter, or the angle grinder, or even the 10-minute rescue. It's the man behind it all. Redouane Fayed once admitted that he had spent his childhood obsessed with crime movies. For years, he copied scenes from Hollywood. Then, eventually, Hollywood began copying him. Because some of the most unbelievable prison escapes ever filmed look almost identical to what he accomplished in real life. The difference is that when the credits roll in a movie, the audience goes home. In reality, people are left to deal with the consequences. A police officer lost her life. Dozens of families were traumatized. Millions of euros were stolen. And one man's search for adrenaline became a decades-long cycle of violence, imprisonment, and escape. Perhaps that's the real lesson behind this story. The greatest prison wasn't built from concrete walls or steel doors. It was built inside Redouane Fayed's own mind. Because after every successful escape, he always found himself right back where he started.